I forgot my headphones, but I think this will be fine. Okay. Yeah, well, talk a little bit about the history because I didn't know about this book, of course, and I think that's very interesting. If you could, and it's Christopher J. Wickham, and your proper title is.
I'm professor of German, actually professor emeritus of German at the University of Texas at San Antonio.
And of German, what does that mean?
Well, when I was teaching here, which was up until a year or so ago, I was teaching German language from elementary German all the way through to the advanced levels, German culture, German literature, history of the German language, German cinema. So a wide array of different topics having to do with German studies.
So German language, the nuts and bolts of learning a language, as well as literature and culture.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very wide.
Yeah, including film and also regional varieties of German. I've done quite a lot of work in Bavarian dialect, Bavarian poetry, Bavarian cinema, and so on.
Wow. All right. And so that said, since your knowledge is so broad and wide, a little bit about the book here, and why the Comanches and the Germans, did they have a strong relationship, or?
Well, this book, The Comanches and Germans on the Texas Frontier, which I wrote with my colleague Dr. Daniel Jello, who is an anthropologist, and his background is in Plains Indian studies, so Native American, specifically Comanche, has to do with an article that was published in Germany in the mid-19th century, 1851, that discussed Comanches and their relationship to two other Native American tribes, namely the Shoshones and the Apaches. And this article claimed to establish a relationship between those three tribes based on language study. And the relation between the Shoshones and the Comanches is well attested and is regarded as unquestioned nowadays. The Apaches, in fact, belong to a different family. But anyway, the article in question that we discuss in detail in the book uses material that was gathered by a German settler in Texas who, as a result of a treaty between the German settlers in the Fredericksburg area and the Penetaka Comanche band, a non-aggression pact, and this settler agreed to go and live with the Comanches after the treaty was signed as part of the deal. The Comanches insisted that in order to ensure the peaceful coexistence of the Germans with the Comanches, that they wanted a German to be living in their village. So this man did that and was there for several months. And during that time, he made a vocabulary list, which then became the first published Comanche dictionary, basically. And it was Comanche to German. The Comanche words were translated into German. Now, this was pretty much ignored by American anthropology and Indian studies at the time, and that was probably because it was published in German. And so in our book, we translate the whole article, including that dictionary and including the cultural notes that this settler also provided about the Comanche and how they live and how they dress and how they work with tools and how they celebrate and how they sing and dance and everything having to do with Comanche life. So we make that available now to an English reading, speaking audience, whereas before it's only been available in German.
So this man on the cover, is he the one who went to live with the Comanches?
No, the man on the cover is the man who wrote the article, and his name is Heinrich Berghaus, and he was a geographer, a cartographer in Germany in the early 19th century, and was well acquainted with Alexander von Humboldt, of course, who wrote a lot and about the New World and visited the New World. And he must have been in touch somehow with this settler, whose name was Emil Krivitz, and we don't know the details of the relationship between Berghaus and Krivitz, but clearly they must have been in touch with each other in order for the information to get from the Comanches via Krivitz to Berghaus and then into this article.
Well, it must have been a very sort of interesting relationship, as I say, at least I guess from an American, since it happened on American soil or Texas soil, mixing Texas and Comanches and Germans all together. It's very sort of, that's really sort of a melting pot.
Yes. There is this contact, this cultural contact between the Germans and the Comanches up in the Fredericksburg area. The history of that settlement in Fredericksburg goes back to a group of noblemen in Germany, the so-called Adelsverein, the Society of German Noblemen for the Protection of Settlers in Texas, or immigrants to Texas. And Fredericksburg as a town was one of their settlements. It actually was intended as a way station, a stopping off point on the way from the coast where the immigrants would land at Indianola, and then they would travel to New Braunfels, which was also a town founded by the Nobleman Society, and then on to Fredericksburg, and then on to the lands, the grant lands that were approved for settlement by this immigrant company. And this is the so-called Fisher-Miller Grant, which begins at the Llano River, and then north of the Llano River is the grant area to which these Germans were headed. So the intent was that they would go from Fredericksburg up to the Fisher-Miller Grant and settle it there. In fact, there were only 4 or 5 settlements established on the grant, most of which did not survive. There's only one of those settlements that is still in existence, and that's Castell. And that actually moved from the north side of the Llano River to the south side of the Llano River, and nowadays actually doesn't stand on the old grant land at all. But that is the only surviving community that was originally set up on those grant lands settled by the Adelsverein.
I read about them. I read this old book, 1924, written by a man named Biggers, and he said that the promotion of what the Germans were going to get when they landed in Texas was this wonderful experience and all these things they would have, and when they landed it was a really rough time, and it wasn't the glorious thing and they had been promised. Is he correct in saying that?
Yes and no. It was a differentiated kind of experience depending on when you arrived, but basically he's right that the Adelsverein seriously underfunded this whole project, and they did make very generous promises of schools and healthcare and a certain amount of land, support until the first harvest, and transportation, all of these things, and were not able to deliver, partly because the funding wasn't there, but partly also because at the time that they were getting started, which was 1845-ish, was the time that Texas joined the Union, so it was no longer a freestanding country, a republic in its own right, and the United States, which Texas had just joined, went to war with Mexico. And so the U.S. Army required all transportation for the military effort. That meant that all the wagons that had been promised to and agreed to, contracted to, for the German immigrants to get from the coast inland were not available. The military had them. So it meant the settlers were stuck at the coast with no way to get inland unless they walked, which many of them did. So there were other issues involved that added to the problems that were inherent in the Adelsverein planning of this.
they really had to have some stick-to-itiveness, didn't they? And the other thing that struck me in my readings was that the Germans stayed put. They didn't pack up and take off. I mean, they stayed put generation after generation, and that accounted for their success, because they didn't just take off after the going got so tough.
Yeah, some did, some didn't. One of the ways in which the German immigration project to Texas was marketed in Germany was that you will be much better off as an immigrant in Texas or anywhere else in the US if you, as Germans, go to a German community in North America. And so the idea of community and sticking together certainly was one of the central aspects. However, having said that, people did move around a lot. A number of people who came to Texas and went to settle in the hill country, in the area north of San Antonio, in the hills, ended up moving to San Antonio, for instance, or moving to other towns. So it's not necessarily the case that they stayed in the first place that they got to and liked and settled at.
But they stayed in Texas.
Many did stay in Texas, and there is a strong Texas tradition of German immigration. Yes.
And it's the German belt. I read about that this from Fredericksburg over to Schulenburg, and this sort of half.
Yes, the first wave of immigration, one might say, from Germany to Texas headed towards what is now, around Schulenburg, around Weimar, Texas, Columbus, and also particularly industry, Fayette County, the LaGrange area, that sort of focal point, Mill Creek, Cat Spring, those were the centers of German settlement early on. So we're talking about the 1830s. Mm-hmm. When the Adelsverein comes and promotes German emigration to Texas, then they are heading more westwards towards what is in fact the frontier and unexplored. And the whole issue of the Comanches and the contact that the Germans have with the Comanches is interesting, because we're not really sure how much the Germans knew about the fact that there were Comanches there, and the land that they had been promised for settlement was actually part of the Comancheria, the southern end of the Comanche range, hunting grounds, grazing grounds, and the land dominated by the Native Americans. So they were going somewhere where it really was frontier.
Yeah.
So the negotiations that take place between the Germans and the Comanches are extremely important for the success and the vitality of those settlements. And very early on, the Adelsverein commissioners and the people responsible for that immigration are interested in negotiation. They're not interested in confrontation. They're interested in coexistence and cooperation with the native population.
Which is a very smart and pragmatic way of doing things.
Yeah, and it comes out of a tradition of thinking in Germany that is informed partly by romantic notions of noble savages and so on, but partly also by ideas of democracy, ideas of self-representation, and a wish to break away from territorial thinking and thinking based on conflict.
So in a way, the German immigrants were also like most settlers of America. They sought freedom and democracy, and they were running around from strict hierarchy and whoever else was treading on them and all that kind of thing. They had the same dream.
Yes. The fact of religion, which plays a large role in many sort of settlement histories, is not such a big one for the Germans. The question of hierarchy And political organization, social organization is also an interesting one because, as I mentioned, this group of people who are sponsoring migration to Texas in Germany, they are noblemen. Many of the noble families in Germany have connections to the English royal family, Victoria and so on. And so there is debate about the importance of the aristocracy in this migration effort, and to what extent they're trying to perpetuate sort of feudal notions of how to run a place. But in general, what happens in Texas is that a very democratic thought pattern becomes established, especially in the German communities. An anti-slavery feeling amongst the German communities. But there again, we have to be careful because the first settlement that the Adlersverein founded, the Nassau plantation, was a slave plantation, and they held slaves. But we do know that many of the Germans were on the side of the Union in the Civil War, and but not all of them. Others felt their allegiance to Texas was strong enough that they should stand by what Texas wanted, and of course Texas was with the Confederacy.
There's sort of exceptions to every rule, because these are more of the things I've been reading about. They love beer, but they were abstemious. Their elections went on for days so that everybody could vote. One thing I was really impressed by, and these things I think are so relevant to what's going on in the world today, is that I think it was in Fredericksburg or one of the towns, there were neither paupers but neither millionaires either. The levels of sanitation were kept very high, so people lived a long time. They really had alles ist in Ordnung, but with that mentality, they did well, and the hard work that they did, that's the only way you could get a society up and running. And free press, they started the first public schools where you didn't have to pay.
Yeah.
So all of these extremely fine democratic ideals.
Well, and they have a lot to do with education as well. A lot of the people who come over are not peasants and artisans, but are highly educated people, with doctors, people with university training. In fact, some of the settlements are referred to as Latin settlements because the people are so educated that they will sit down and they will discuss philosophy in Latin. In Texas, Sisterdale is a place that is referred to as a Latin settlement because Ottomar von Baer, who was one of the first settlers there, was well known for this. He would entertain people in his home. He had a very large and complete library, and people would sit around and talk Latin. And this was a destination, so that Frederick Law Olmsted, for instance, who is well known for designing and laying out Central Park in New York,
Dane.
Was he Danish or Swedish? I'm not sure by origin. Uh-huh. He traveled through Texas on horseback and paid a visit to Ottomar von Baer in Sisterdale and writes about it in his account of his journey through Texas. And so this level of education also plays a role because a few years after the founding of places like New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, in Germany, you have the March Revolution of 1848. And this is a revolution that attempts to introduce liberal and parliamentary government to the German-speaking states. Now, you have to remember, at this time, there really is no Germany. Germany does not exist as a political entity, as a political state. That comes in 1860.
Principalities.
Yes, you have principalities, territories, duchies, dukedoms, and so on, some kingdoms, and they're German-speaking, and they exist in a confederation of a type.
What was it called then? I don't know the name of Germany when it was not. It was not a country, a nation. It was a bunch of principalities. Did it have a name? Or?
Well, up until the very early 19th century, about 1806 or so, you have the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire exists for about 1,000 years, since Charlemagne, and is finally abolished by Napoleon when he marches through. So the Holy Roman Empire to a large extent, is congruent with what we think of as Germany. Between the end of the Holy Roman Empire in 1871, when Germany is consolidated as a nation under Bismarck, you have this sort of loose collection of states, the Confederation, and but you need a passport very often to go from one of these states to another. And because all the little states and territories and duchies and so on have their own borders, they will levy taxes on goods that are traveling across their border. And so it's a very inefficient kind of thing. And of course, there's no central capital. Unlike England that has London, France that has Paris and so on, Germany really has no national capital until the founding of the Second Empire, so to speak, in 1871.
I see. Right. Okay. All that was going on. Well, it's a tremendous amount of history. I guess I'll better start with the questions that I came. Well, that's all fascinating. I'll start with the questions that I came with. So all of that, and the Germans. I remember a New York Times wrote about the highs and lows of German thought, that they were so capable of such amazing high intellectual thought, but then on the flip side, they were capable of such sort of base, referring I guess to World War I and II, sort of base behavior, some of the basest behavior, but at the same time some of the highest intellectual thought. So that said, so since they are so capable of these things, what about in this era of sort of diminished intellectual thought, Facebook and YouTube, comparing that landscape to, somebody like Goethe? It's sort of that's a big thing to cross. How can German culture survive in this 21st century?
Well, German culture is doing just fine. From the United States, we tend to get a perception of Germany that's very much filtered through the media and also through the new media that you're talking about, which tends to be very selective in what it presents. But by the same token, these new media are also a way into the vast richness of German culture that exists nowadays. Just the other day, for instance, I was online looking at the Mediathek, which is like a library of media, sort of media bibliothek, if you like, from ZDF, which is one of the German television companies. And there was a broadcast from 2016, which I was able to access through my computer, about Hermann Lehmann, who was one of the German immigrants to Texas, who was abducted at the age of 10 by Apaches and later went to the Comanches and lived with them for 8 years or so before being sort of rehabilitated into the German community. And this was a very high-quality production using many of the contemporary bells and whistles that we expect with the very finest of modern TV digital production. So that is out there. You can also on these Mediathek websites, and most of the German TV companies have them. The Bavarian radio company, the Bayerischer Rundfunk, has one as well. You can find German rock concerts. You can find programs about regional culture and specificities, whether it's cooking or song or dance or landscape, history, all sorts of things. There are thrillers and detective stories. There are complete movies. All of this stuff is out there through modern media to be accessed from here. Now, of course, it's in German, so it helps if you can understand the German.
Are a fabulous new. Of course, they're wonderful. And I think sometimes people forget with new media and with these that these are just tools. There are of course content producers out there, which would be my next question. But these are primarily tools to deliver content. So it's whatever content that you desire to see is going to be up to you. That's
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's made German culture more accessible
Yeah.
because of these tools.
Yeah. Yes, and if if you're interested in whether it's German or Austrian or culture from other German-speaking parts of the world, like Switzerland and so on, you can find a lot of material. You can find a lot of regional material, for instance, that's very specific about dialects or about regional culture. It's all there, and it's there to be found if you look for it and seek it out.
Exactly. So what about, what is German culture like today? We think about Beethoven, Bach, and Goethe, but is Germany producing any greats today of that level, or is that not a fair comparison?
Well, of course, the people you mentioned were working within their own specific historic context. And yes, they were pushing the envelope, they were innovative, they were setting new directions. The fact of their greatness really only becomes established over the course of time. What has our culture deemed to be worthy, valuable, and of merit. We don't know yet which of the current culture producers will still be around and will still be revered 100 years from now or 150 years from now. But there are certainly a lot of very innovative, productive, and thought-provoking culture makers within the German-speaking world. Whether it's in cinema, and within Munich and Berlin, there are very creative groups doing things with cinema that often don't get released in this country, except perhaps on the art cinema circuit.
Are
but they are there.
Germans still pursuing that high intellectual thought? The 21st century young Germans are still pursuing their heritage in a way, their
definitely
heritage in literature and music and
definitely. And I think if you go to German universities, you will find that the general discussion, the level of discussion there is very high. If you look at participation rates in elections, for instance, it's very high compared to the United States, close to twice as high for the most part. People are engaged, people are informed. If you read German newspapers, you will see that the level of discussion is very high, very detailed, very informed, and it represents a mode of thinking, I think, that you don't find in the comparable publications in the United States.
I lived in Hamburg just a short time. I was working at working as a copywriter at an ad agency, but I remember Der Spiegel was about that thick,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Time, our magazine, our premier magazine in the U.S. became so thin.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Der Spiegel is still there, and
Is it still as thick?
Yes,
Even though it's probably online. Huh?
it is also online.
Yeah,
Yeah,
of
Der
course.
Spiegel online
Yeah.
is also widely read, and there are other publications like Focus, which was set up as a kind of an alternative to Der Spiegel. But yeah, these are very popular, very well-read, and very penetrating in their analysis and reporting.
So the 21st century sort of, it's not diminishing anything of classical German thought. It's in a way can be helping it. Then nothing is declining in Germany in terms of
I think that
thought and literature and music and.
Germans are still pushing the boundaries in areas of culture that we think of as traditional culture, whether it's music, classical music, or whether it's contemporary media, whether it's new art forms and expression. And we've been fortunate in San Antonio in having Sebastian Lang-Lessing, for instance, as the artistic director of our symphony orchestra. a German conductor, very well liked, very accomplished, international reputation, and he is here leading our symphony. We've had exhibits of contemporary German artists here in San Antonio, organized by Angelika Jansen Brown, and they are also very popular, well attended, and so the links and the connections are there. Mm-hmm. Fairly recently, the city of San Antonio established a sister city relationship with Darmstadt, Germany, and so this opens the door for cultural, educational, business contacts and exchanges. Mm-hmm. And so the links are there between Texas and Germany, San Antonio and Germany in particular, and there is a lot to bring across those bridges from Germany to enrich our life in Texas.
And the Germans really are continue in the tradition of being real doers. They really do things. I was talking to somebody in regard to this story, and I said, I don't see that on the American side. In fact, Voice of America's, of course, budget was cut and hiring stopped, but, here's the Goethe Institute hiring me and others to do work, and it's paid for, I assume, by the German government, and they seem to still roll up their shirt sleeves and really do things.
Yes, the Goethe Institute in particular has been a mainstay of promoting German culture around the world, including the United States, for decades, since World War II. And there used to be a Goethe Institute in Houston, Texas. Now the efforts of the Goethe Institute in North America have been cut back because of the changing global scene. The Goethe Institute needs to invest its energies more in places that need German instruction, for instance, language instruction, so that in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe, there is a greater concentration of the energies of the Goethe Institute than there used to be, and probably than there is in the United States. But it's still a very important cultural outreach organization for Germany, and the Germanists and German studies people in the United States are also very dependent on it, and very thankful for the fact that it's there.
Yeah. And last question, this is not on the sheet, but I was just wondering, in these times, American international relationships are sort of, a little tenuous at best, and but the Germans always seem to really, in this modern era, and Merkel seemed to be a very good chancellor, that they really sort of keep their mind open about things, and they're very important in Europe, of course, and they're sort of a leader in Europe, aren't they? Sort of Germany and France and England are the three leaders. So I'm sure the Germans sort of keep an international eye on what's happening.
Yes, there is no question that Germany is perhaps the most important economic and political power within the European Union, and therefore, because of the role of the European Union worldwide, their influence is magnified through that lens. In a way, Germany has become a model, or the model, for Western democracy. One has to remember that in the wake of World War II, Germany, West Germany at that time, was refounded in a way, using the best lessons and principles that had been learned in the West. And so you had an opportunity to start again. And so the best practices having to do with labor relations, having to do with healthcare and the funding of healthcare, having to do with political structures and representation in the political system, all of the lessons that had been learned in the West before that time were put into practice in Germany, in West Germany at that time, and have been allowed to blossom since then, so that you have a very robust and strong and working system that is the envy of other countries worldwide. The German healthcare system, the German education system, the German industrial system, all are models that we look to now. Public transportation system, all of these are things that we look to now from here and say, oh yeah, there's some good lessons to be learned there that, if applied in the United States or in other countries, could do a lot to move us forward.
They really, is that sort of, is that sort of their apology in a way for World War II becoming a great country of democracy, in a way shedding to compensate for World War II? They say, well, we have to make a fresh start now. We're going to if you've done something very bad, you've been in prison, and you've been serving your time. When you come out, often they become exemplary citizens. Maybe it had something, maybe there was a little of that psychology. I don't know.
In some respects, I think that is probably true. I think, for instance, in the case of migrants, people coming into Europe, wanting to come into Europe from North Africa and from the Middle East. As you know, Angela Merkel had a policy of taking everybody, essentially, for a while. Now they had to change that, but yes, I think that was very much with the idea in mind that we as a nation have responsibilities, and we have perhaps a greater sensibility to people who need to emigrate from their country and need a new place to make a fresh start than perhaps other countries who did not go through the Holocaust and who did not go through the World War II.
Yeah, because they become really sort of they're pacifists now, proud pacifists. Can you say that? Do you think so?
Well, there certainly are pacifists in Germany, but they have an army and they are a major player in NATO.
Yeah, right.
But they are very aware that the Constitution prohibits them from being an outward aggressor. Defense is the priority. And I think that I have also found, when I have taken students, for instance, from the University of Texas at San Antonio or from other places to Germany, the Germans are very hospitable and are very willing to accept American students. And I have heard verbatim the justification for that being, well, when you were there for us, you were there. So we will reciprocate by being good hosts. And it's not a purely pro quo kind of thinking, but there is that underlying thought.
Yeah.
That we have a lot to be thankful for, so we'll pass it forward.
Yeah. See, well, that's a very good interview.